Introduce Jeff Cooper as the Chief Executive of the Infrastructure Commission, running through from the Treasury here, obviously, and we've got officials here from Crown Infrastructure Delivery, National Infrastructure Funding and Financing Company. What's that? Okay. And Treasury and a range of officials for all of your questions. But yeah, happy to get straight into it.
Okay, right. We'll get straight into questions. Who's going to kick me off? Here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. I thought I'd start on a positive note today. There's a strong call from the sector, broad sector involved in infrastructure, for a bipartisan approach to this. And there's, I think, some genuine effort across Parliament to try and live up to that. But I thought it would be useful for the context of today's discussion to give an outline of how you believe bipartisanship can work within infrastructure policy and how you'd like to see that play out.
That's the question?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, you'd have heard the same calls that we've all heard for many years, actually, around building up a greater bipartisanship around this stuff. And that's part of the reason why we campaigned on a 30-year national infrastructure plan being developed in government. And obviously that is underway. And so I might get Jeff to talk to the details for members if they're interested. But one of the first things we did upon coming to government early 2024, late 23, was task the Commission with developing that plan, which they've been doing for the last year or so. And of course, it's being launched next week at a symposium here at Parliament. So I want to use that as the basis for, I mean, I'm hopeful that as much of that can be endorsed as possible across the Parliament, and then we use that as the basis for ongoing discussions and policy discussions and funding. There's going to be a lot in the plan, and I'll get Jeff to talk to it in a moment. Also indicated last year when we announced that the plan was underway that tended to hold a special debate in Parliament. We have to get the Business Committee to agree, but I feel like you and I might know some people who can sort that out for us. Have a special debate in Parliament to have so all political parties can kind of canvass the report. Clearly, because it's a strategy report, as per the Infrastructure Commission Act, excuse me, the government has to. The report next week will be a draft report, and then the government is statutorily required to respond. I think, but is it 6 months?
Yes.
6 months, yeah. So government has to respond to that. So there'll be a process underway around that. But I'm hoping that we can have a parliamentary debate and discussion around it as well. Yeah, so that's kind of my start of 10 around that.
In order for that to provide some continuity to the sector and some confidence, which is what we're seeing is lacking at the moment, some concern around pipeline, around certainty, so that they can consider taking or keeping workers, taking them on. What needs to be in that plan to be able to provide that? Because there's a lot hinging on that.
Well, it's. I mean, without. It's really is also a question for you. So.
Well, I know my side. I don't know yours.
Or do you? Because are you sure?
Yes.
Okay.
How about you just give me an answer?
Well, what's the question?
Well, what needs to be in the plan? Because at the moment, frankly, the attitude of some ministers of bipartisanship is we'll work with you if you agree with us.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's good enough. And so if we want to give the infrastructure sector some certainty, if there is going to be a genuine effort to limit any pausing or cancellation of projects moving forward, that there be work before decisions are made as opposed to an announcement later in the piece. I
mean, I've always said that if you can agree on, if we could get kind of broad agreement on kind of 80% of the pipeline and 80% of the policy settings, that'd be good. But I'm also realistic that political parties are going to disagree about infrastructure priorities up to a point. So just to take a practical example, if we're just being honest with ourselves, the Greens are going to be more into cycling, without speaking for you, Julianne, but the Greens are going to be more into cycling than probably other parties. And that's fine, we're probably going to be more into roads than maybe the Greens would. That's kind of fine. Like at a certain level, there does have to be a degree of political debate around these things. Like, I'm not one who says you can like completely depoliticise all this stuff, because you're dealing with Crown capital, you're dealing with multi-billion-dollar funding. It's important that people have different views on that, and it's actually to be expected in a democracy. But if you can agree on the fundamentals, that's a good step forward, and I think that would be welcomed by the sector. Take one practical example, for example, asset management. We've done that really badly in New Zealand for 25, 30 years. The Infrastructure Commission's done a whole series of reports over the last 4 or 5 years that point that out. By one metric, we rank last in the OECD in terms of asset management, fourth to last, I think, generally. One of those metrics, we're last in the OECD in terms of asset management. We subject local government to a whole range of different requirements around asset registers and asset maintenance plans that we don't subject central government to. So we make local councils go through quite a sophisticated process of, CapEx requirements and looking after the assets that they build, but we don't subject our own capital intensive agencies to the same scrutiny or requirements. And so, I've kicked off a program of work around changing that. It'd be good if we could get an agreement, and I'm sure it's part of the infrastructure plan that the Commission will produce next week. I'm sure there'll be some recommendations to that effect, because there have been already so far from them. If we could agree on something like that, for example, that'd be really good, I reckon.
I agree. The fact is that wherever there is as much broad agreement on the framework and even funding mechanisms, ideally, on the whole, then we're going to get a long way. We're not going with just like, absolutely agree with you. We can guarantee we will not agree on everything you've done. We think some of the things you've done are stupid. But the work in the infrastructure plan is a perfect example. What I would like to see is a commitment to you don't have a say what's in the plan, but you do have a process after that you review it and respond to it.
Yeah.
And that is on you, and that has to be in your words. But there's an opportunity there to work with the other side to actually identify where there is broad agreement and include that in your response.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was saying at the start, is that we're going to have to respond, and I want there to be a parliamentary debate around it. And, you've been well briefed by the Commission so far, and when the plan started to be developed, I wrote to everybody, your predecessor, and offered them a briefing from the Commission, and I understand a number of political parties have taken that up, which I welcome. So, this has ultimately got to be an infrastructure plan for the country, not just for the government. The Infrastructure Commission is statutorily independent of the government. Obviously, they work closely with us, but they have an independent role for that reason. And if you go all the way back to when they were set up back in 2018, 2019, they were done for that reason. So I think the statutory independence is important. So very, very open to that. Very open to that.
Just one follow up on that. It's good that we're having the debate, but what I'm putting to you, you don't need to respond now. You can have a think about it if you like, but the government needs to respond to this plan. If you work with the opposition parties as part of that, and in your formal response, you can indicate where you have worked with opposition parties and there is agreement, I think that's going to stand in pretty good stead and certainly be welcomed by the sector, rather than having to wade through a parliamentary debate to try and find out where they stand.
Yeah, I'm happy to commit to that now. I'm very open to doing that. Just making the obvious point, it may require, we may not always agree. So for example, you guys have got to figure out where you're at on PPPs, for example, because you've had about 9 different positions.
We know where we're at with that.
Are you sure?
And yes, I am actually.
Okay.
And I've met with the likes of NIFCO, and we've talked about it in detail and know exactly where we stand.
Okay.
This is one of the things that I'm actually trying to avoid, right? Is that we can't help ourselves. This is the game we're in. We talk about bipartisanship, but we also take every opportunity to have a crack at each other.
Well, you just said some of the stuff we've done was stupid.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly right. We can't help ourselves. This is entirely my point. But surely on the fundamentals, like keeping in mind that Barb Edmonds, on behalf of our party, who was the spokesperson at the time, wrote a forward as part of your document on PPPs as a funding mechanism.
Yeah. They're a procurement tool. They're not a funding mechanism.
Yep.
But yeah.
I agree with that too. But at the end of the day, surely we've got to take every opportunity to try and provide that certainty. And that's all I'm just putting it to you.
Yeah, I'm up for that. I think we're on the same page. I think the sector would welcome it, and as well as I do. So I'm up for that. And and obviously that'll get started next week once the report comes out. There is much that political parties in Parliament agree on already when it comes to infrastructure. So sometimes there's a bit more heat than light in this debate.
I don't think the public would know that though. So we can take those opportunities to show them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the National Land Transport Plan, changes. Anyway, we won't get into that, but yeah.
Okay.
Look, that's a useful start. We've got SUPs 1, 2, 3, and I'll probably have 1, 2. So
thanks, Mr. Chair. Minister, just wondering if you can elaborate for us how that infrastructure pipeline's going, particularly as it relates to that 80%. What are the stuff that you're thinking about that we just need to do, that there is probably actually board support, we need certain bridges built and roads expanded. Can you give us a sense of how the pipeline is looking?
So one of the things that, and this goes all the way back to kind of 2019, 2020, and is actually an example of bipartisanship, because you've got to remember the commission was set up in a bipartisan way as well, backed by the previous government, is they got given the task of publishing a pipeline, because everyone always used to say, what's the pipeline, like what is there coming down in the next 10, 15 years? And so the commission's over that time, it's taken a bit of time, but has built up a pretty good series of pieces of information. I might get Jeff to talk to it. There's 206 billion in the March 2025 quarter in the pipeline, and they break it down by regions and different sectors as well. Jeff, do you want to talk about how you create it?
Yeah, no, that's right. So we every quarter go out to about 110 different organisations and ask for their intentions on infrastructure. As the Minister said, that's 206 billion at the moment. And what we aim to do is get a timeline around that. So, when their intentions are for going out and procuring that, or if it's in early stage planning, so on and so forth. So that the idea there is to give as much certainty as the sector can currently provide, keeping in mind that a lot of the time asset owners are trying to buy options with things that they may do if the demand does arise. And that's been a critical point, I think, for the sector. There's nothing certain about infrastructure investment a lot of the time. Asset owners are dealing with terrific uncertainty. And so a lot of the timelines, reflect just those points. We break it down, as the Minister said, by sector, also by funding stream, right? So we're trying to get to this idea, not just of what the pipeline is, but what is a credible, fundable pipeline? And increasingly, we're starting to paint a much clearer picture of what that looks like.
It improves almost every quarter. There are 14 councils who do not contribute to the pipeline. I think 18 months ago that was around 30 or 40, so the numbers are getting better every quarter. But I can give you the list of 14 if you would like. And if you would like to, I don't have them in front of me, but we can give that to you as a supplementary. And if any of them you are the local MPs for, I'd strongly encourage you to tell them to contribute, because it adds to that. It adds to a richer picture, right? I don't know why they're not contributing. It's actually not that hard. They've made it as easy as possible to get it into the mix.
This should all be in LTPs and everything as well.
What's that?
They should all be in LTPs and everything as well, so they should know what they're doing.
Yeah, but the point is sometimes. But the point is to have a single source of truth for what's in the pipeline. And it's done quarterly, and it's not actually that hard to do, right?
No. It's all standardised. It's owned by the asset owner.
Yeah, but you're not suggesting they're not doing anything. They're just not telling you about it.
Yeah, there's 14 councils who aren't. Yeah. All of central government's now in.
Yes.
Yeah, but we're talking about a few laggard recalcitrant councils.
My point was they know what they're supposed to be doing. There shouldn't be too hard for them to tell you.
Well, if they don't do it, we can just mandate that they do it. But I'd rather not. Because that takes time and money. I'd rather they just do it.
He loves those.
Anyway, carry on. What's that?
Love those mandates for council.
Well, we make them do all sorts of things for the right reasons, and this would be the same thing.
Okay, Julianne.
I guess I'm curious about how we can have a 30-year infrastructure plan without maybe certainty of funding for projects. Like right now in transport alone, there's only certainty for 3 years. And even in the full 10-year GPS, it's a lot, like half of it is unfunded in the out years. So just curious about how you see the plans for funding projects in a 30-year plan.
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to get a 30-year funded plan. I mean, that's unrealistic, because we live in a dynamic environment, and you know, the need, you know, particular projects, the economics come and go and change, and that is of course the actual one of the challenges with a 30-year plan, right? New Zealand of 2055 will be very different to New Zealand of 2025, in the same way that in 1995 was very different to today. But there is value, I think, in looking out to the future and saying, what are the needs that we're going to have around infrastructure? And you'll see on Wednesday, but the Commission's done quite a degree of work around projecting out using the best available evidence that we've got, and that's ultimately all you can do, around what are going to be the key drivers demographically and geographically around what sort of infrastructure we're going to need into the future by 2050, 2055, and what that looks like from a funding point of view. And that, of course, means you can then calibrate what government does around funding in order to meet some of those needs. So I'm not pretending that a 30-year plan is the answer to everything. It's not, but it gives you a guide and it allows you to calibrate your policy settings and your funding settings in order to meet that. I'd rather have that information than not, rather than just kind of make it up as we go along.
I guess, and then my other question was just related to what Kieran was asking, which is, I mean, it's great that we're going to have a parliamentary debate, but that's not the same thing as having cross-party input into specific projects that we might all agree on. It's quite different, like asking us all to agree to a 30-year plan that you guys are putting together.
It's an independent, it's not, we're not putting it, I'm not putting it together. That I want to stress that. I mean, as I sort of said at the start, it's the Commission's plan. Right. So which is the independent statutory advisor to government around infrastructure policy and funding and particularly strategy. That's their core role in the system, is strategy and policy. So it's not my plan, it's their plan. The government will have to respond to the plan. I'm really happy to engage with you as I've already been doing in the same way that I've been engaging with Kieran around that. And as I've sort of said publicly to the sector and said here today, you know, if we can agree on 80% of what's good, that'd be good. But you know, just caveat it that there are going to be differences, right? Like where political parties have different views and different values. You know, if we all agreed, this would be a fairly boring place.
Cam.
Thank you. My question was, going into those the PPPs as used for procurement and what Treasury's been working on there. Can you talk about what Treasury's been doing to work on the PPP model? And actually, there has been a lot of, and if you could give some depth about the way it works, because there's been a fair bit of fear mongering around the place about it being a move to privatisation, as every time this government does anything innovative, there seems to be that sort of scaremongering.
Yeah, I'll give you some.
It'd be good to hear you explain it for the committee.
Give you some high level remarks, and I might get Lani to give an update on where we're at on the PPP model. So, PPP is not new in New Zealand. They've been used before for a range of different things, including schools, by the way, but also roads, prisons. The model, the sort of policy framework had not basically been updated since 2017. So we've updated that in government. It's been done by the Commission and by Treasury. I'll get Lani to take you through the details of that. We just need to be clear about the fact that private capital exists in the New Zealand infrastructure system right now. And the government does not go out and build with the Ministry of Works roads and hospitals and schools anymore. We use private firms to go and do that building. You know, we don't have the Ministry of Works anymore. So we shouldn't be fearful about private capital. It's just a procurement tool. And potentially, depending on how you structure the deal and how you design it, can bring real efficiencies and synergies into the market, particularly around asset management and asset maintenance, for example. Is what you get with a PPP often is someone will build a road for you, for example, or a school or whatever, and then built into the contract is the ongoing, 25 or 30 years of maintenance as well. And so you get that essentially guaranteed or contractually guaranteed level of service and maintenance. And you can get, depending on how you do it, you can get some quite sophisticated service quality agreements as part of that. I'll get Lani to just talk briefly about where the model stuff's got up to in terms of policy and process.
So as the Minister mentioned before, Infracom put out their blueprint and in regards to what we need to do in terms of refreshing the PPP model here. So that was published in December last year.
Yeah, it's in
I recall.
24, yeah.
It sort of gave a lot of indications of where we need to really update our model, given we haven't really been active in using the PPP procurement model for a number of years. Things like big cost reimbursement, thinking about how we do cost risk allocation and do that a bit more sophisticated, capital contributions, a number of features that were outlined in the blueprint. So for the last 6 months, Treasury's been trying to take those directional aspects of change, which was heavily consulted, drew on international experience in terms of what they've done, and update pretty much the PPP guidelines and contracting arrangements.
Could I just follow us up on that? Just so Infrastructure Commission's talked a lot about and you mentioned it, Minister, about our lack of maintenance, and you touched on the schedule, how that can be built into a contract. When the Infrastructure Commission's been doing work on New Zealand's placement in the OECD and the world for looking after our gear once we've built it, how did you look at PPPs? Was there any advice around PPPs in a way to alleviate some of that problem that we have?
Yeah, I mean, that work that we did was partly about benchmarking how we're going on asset management. So it didn't necessarily get into procurement, but what has been mentioned is that in the blueprint that we published, we did talk about the possible upside of maintenance through PPPs, which is, as the Minister's just said, you can essentially safeguard the spending of maintenance on the asset. Second to that, you can also, I think, connect the maintenance spend to the original CapEx spend so that you're thinking about what those ongoing OpEx costs look like into the future and how to minimise them over the sort of whole of life.
Cool. And I mean, yesterday we had hearings with the Health Select Committee, where we've got $9 billion worth of on the books assets for Health New Zealand, but the replacement value being north of 38 billion. How do you think having that sort of model built in this sort of mechanism would have avoided that? And if Health New Zealand or previous iterations thereof had followed such a model?
Yeah, well, I think, for all infrastructure, but particularly for health infrastructure, when we're doing that initial build, the criticality is to understand what those whole of life costs look like. And the metaphor here is that if you do the deferred maintenance, if you stop painting the house, you're going to end up having to replace the weatherboards. And what we're finding, and perhaps health is the pin-up example of this, is that can be really expensive. Now, the thing that sort of troubles me is that oftentimes when we look at the projects that we're funding, a lot of them, both in central government and local government, are renewals projects. And the more expensive those get, the less we have for other new infrastructure services, which we all know we need as well. So the point here is that if we can optimize that stuff that we know we're going to have to do, we cannot get away from it. It leaves more for everything else.
I'm going to go straight to that point as well. It's absolutely fabulous to hear all the conversation, not only today, but in previous conversations that we've had about asset management and asset maintenance, because I think it's absolutely brilliant. And and hopefully that means we've got a lot less surprises that turn up from time to time as well. But just thinking about in terms of a 30-year infrastructure plan, there's got to be a bunch of assumptions that are made there. So those will be laid bare, presumably very, very clear what the assumptions are, and possibly what scenarios there might be sitting in there as well. So that if the world looks like this, this is what it could look like if the world looks like that, because there is no certainty is if we think the world's going to look like that, we'll be wrong.
So there's two ways that two points I'd make here. The first is what we're trying to do in the plan is show a little bit more colour on what New Zealand as a country of 5 million can afford to spend on infrastructure services. And the way that we've gone about that is by looking at what we have spent in the past. So that's an important starting point, because oftentimes I think with infrastructure planning, we don't nail it down to what a country can actually afford to spend. So that's an important part. We'll show a little bit of detail on what that looks like. On your part around the assumptions that we're making, this really is an important part of decision on capital investment decision making, which is that you never know what the future is going to look like. And with many of the asset owners we work with and talk to, they're all grappling with this. Now, New Zealand could, in 30 years' time, at the high end of statistics, New Zealand could be a country of 8 million. It could be less, it could be more. These are just projections, right? But asset owners need to think about, well, how should I think about investment in a world where the future is uncertain? And the plan will give some advice on the sort of approaches we would expect to see, right? So in a world where you don't know what the future population looks like, sometimes you might actually just buy options so that you can scale up quickly if required, rather than buying a whole bunch of investment when, if the people don't come, you have to maintain assets you don't need. So it's these sorts of approaches that we'll be speaking to, and the more uncertainty you face, the more options you should be buying, like land protection, for instance.
So on one of the other bits, which has been music to my ears, having the commission, previous members of the commission coming to this committee and saying, look, one of the things we really like the idea of is having some sort of demographic strategy so we actually know what we're doing. And from a government point of view, governments have regularly said we want councils in this case to plan for 30 years of housing growth. And councils will probably go, well, how much is that going to be? Because we're not in charge of immigration. And so having a plan around those things would help guide how much infrastructure is required. So my question really is how we align those things together. So how much of the infrastructure investment is growth related and how much of it is maintaining the stuff?
You'll see some of that in the report next week.
Yeah.
But, as Jeff says, it's 30 years. And so there's assumptions and there's forecasts. But also, as I said at the start, New Zealand of 2025 is very different to if you go back to 1995, when there will almost certainly have been a report done by some august body in 1995 about what New Zealand will look like in 2025. It'd be interesting to look at that. I suspect many of the things would be wrong.
Indeed. Okay.
Right. Just one further comment on that, because it did right. Most of those things are wrong. One thing that we are very good at predicting, however, is the aging nature of the population. Oftentimes we're out on how big we're going to be, but the relative aging and demographic trends actually forecasters are very good at predicting. And so in the plan, what we'll see is a little bit more emphasis on the fact that New Zealand is an aging population and that we're very unlikely to be able to get away from that.
None of us can turn that clock back, even if we want to. Kieran.
Thank you. Can I just check it? Is this a primary or is this?
It's a primary. Yeah, go for your life if you want. You can do whatever you want with it.
Whatever I want with it.
Well, not quite.
How
But,
good's
within standing orders and reason.
Minister, I'm keen to talk about workforce.
Yeah.
This is something that's of particular concern to us. In part because of the uncertainty, and there are many reasons for that. There are thousands and thousands of people that were working in this sector, broadly construction, but infrastructure, that are no longer. And I met with industry associations recently that says we're really worried about our members. We're losing businesses all over the show, not just because of uncertainty in central government projects, but also because of a significant slowdown through the local government channels as well. And I'm keen to understand what you're doing about that now.
Yeah.
A lot of this planning is going to hopefully deal with that later.
Yeah.
But my worry is if we don't sort something out now, we're not going to have the workforce when that work comes up.
Yeah. So there's a complicated picture and there's a few things going on, which just worth having the time to talk about. The first is ultimately in the broader construction, workforce and in the broader economy is the high interest rates over the last 2 or 3 years that's been the biggest impact in terms of construction, right? Because that's the purpose of high interest rates is to slow things down in order to take the heat out of the economy to get inflation back within the band. So that was that's the way monetary policy has worked, and so we shouldn't be surprised that's had the impact. And sometimes you see people saying things like, "Well, the government should have done this counter-cyclical thing in order to, done a bunch of stuff in order to keep things going." That would have been in contradistinction to what monetary policy was trying to do. It would have been counterproductive. So high interest rates that we've experienced since 21, 22, 23, 24, or 22 in particular, since the Reserve Bank started raising the OCR to deal with inflation post-COVID, has had that effect. And so now what you're seeing is the OCR coming down, flowing through to interest rates, and you're starting to see with most commentators tend to suggest we've reached the bottom of the building consent cycle, for example. You're now starting to see consents pick up, and so and obviously we're doing what we can around freeing up land for development and things like that, which is in the broader housing thing. So there is a lot of activity going on in the infrastructure space right now. I mean, there's a lot in the pipeline, but also the indications of spend are very consistent, and there's multi-billion dollars worth of work underway right now. The reason why I say you've got to be a little bit careful around, because I hear what you're saying around people saying, well, there's people are struggling. The engineers have said that, for example. One of the things that has been happening over the last 18 months or so since we came in is we've been moving towards modular standardised designs in schools and hospitals, for example, a lot more. You take schools, for example, we did more school classrooms in 2024 than I think, don't quote me on this, but I think I'm right in saying for many years since whenever. And one of the ways we're able to do that is by moving towards standardised modular classrooms. And I think we've now got the cost down to kind of $700,000 or so, when the average cost of a classroom used to be around 1.1, 1.2 million. And so moving away from those kind of bespoke, architecturally designed schools and classrooms has given us significant cost savings, but it has had an impact on some people in the sector. And I've talked about that with the engineers, for example. There's a complicated picture. It depends who you talk to. On the council side of things, Minister Simon Watts and I are encouraging councils who have got confirmed funding sources through NZTA, through the National Land Transport Plan, to crack on with projects. We are encouraging them to do that. Ultimately, those are decisions for them.
You're right that it's complex, but it's also not as simple as saying local government should just get on with it, as you know. They may have some level of funding through their FAR rates and all those sorts of things, but we also know that councils are so stretched that even if they only need to front up with 10% of that roading cost, they can't complete that work. And so hold on. We saw that for example, after the Nelson floods, where the government came in with a 95% FAR rate for Marlborough Council and they couldn't front up with the remaining 5%.
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't dismiss that. That is a fact. And so on one hand, you're saying that you don't agree with those within the sector that are saying that this is the time that the government should be building houses of the counter-cyclical, I think you called it. But also at the same time, local government should get onto it. Surely there's a role that government can play right now.
Yeah, well, different councils are in different situations. There is plenty of money in the National Land Transport Plan and the GPS for the government's contribution towards meeting regional land transport priorities, for example, and we are encouraging them to crack on with that work.
Do you accept that across successive governments, the stop, start, pause, cancel nature of projects has had an impact on the confidence in the sector?
Well, it depends exactly what you're talking about. I accept that after 2017, the radical change in direction of the National Land Transport Plan at the time had a significant impact on a range of projects and the sector. So yes.
So you're willing to say that one government cancelled projects that had an effect, but you're not willing to concede that you guys cancelling project hasn't?
Well, it depends on when you cancel them and for what reason you cancel them. So, for example, I stand by our decisions around light rail and IREX, for example, and let's get Wellington moving. We could have just come in and said, well, they're underway to a certain point, we're just going to carry on. But our view was, and this goes to the point around bipartisanship and where it has its limits, our view was that they are the wrong projects for the country. They're too expensive, it depends which one, but generally too expensive, not good value for money, in some cases undeliverable, and take Lake Onslow, for example, literally unconsentable and undeliverable. And it was the right thing to do to just say, you know what, we're actually just not going to proceed with that. So, yeah.
Gillian. So.
Well, yeah, it was just, actually, there were a whole lot of projects that were council projects that got defunded and a number that, would have already potentially been contracted. So it's not so much the big projects that were only in planning stage, like Auckland Light Rail, where that could have still been rescoped significantly. The ferries, you probably could have rescoped the portside infrastructure and not canceled the contract and saved us all years of not having sufficient capacity across
The
the Cook
contract,
Strait.
the contract for the ferries, the portside infrastructure was the problem because of the contract. So that's the whole point. The contract was for ferries that were too large and couldn't fit into the ports. That's the whole point. And no one thought about that. And then there was successive gateway review after gateway review saying red flag, red flag. Even Grant Robertson bailed out of that, tried to bail out.
I think what I'm really struggling with is that it's not governments, subsequent governments that have canceled previous projects. Your government has canceled way more projects, particularly if we include state housing builds some were under contract. I spoke to a builder in my electorate who said he had $70 million worth of work building new housing wiped from December 2023. The accusations around previous Labor government canceling projects,
If it was
they
December,
didn't cancel a single thing that was already under
if
contract.
it was December 23, well, that's not true. I mean, if it was just, the Tauranga, Tauranga Northern Link was literally.
No, it wasn't contracted. It wasn't contracted.
It wasn't contracted,
Let's have
but
that
they were
time,
a month,
Julian.
they were a
Quite
month,
different.
a month away from
Julian.
signing the contract. They're a month away from signing the contract when you and Phil Twyford cancelled the Tauranga Northern Link. In relation to your state housing thing in December 2023, that was probably cancelled in mid 2023. People sometimes talk to me about the Arlington project. Megan would stop the Arlington project in
I'm
Wellington.
not talking about the Arlington.
Okay, rightio. But Arlington, even the last government found Arlington to be too expensive because it was $1.2 million per apartment. Even those guys,
Basically,
even
you
they
can only
blanched
identify
it.
one project which you say was close to being under contract that was then asked to be rescoped, which is quite different than what has happened since you came into government and right across the board, whether it's state housing, whether it's schools, whether it's roads and other transport projects that actually had the rug pulled out on them.
Well, I don't accept that. There are a whole range of projects that are underway right now that are being built, and there's a whole range of ones that are about to come to market, including in the next 6 months, which are really exciting. Otaki to North Levin, Melling Interchange and the Hutt, Brougham Street down in Christchurch, Waikiri Gorge in the East Coast. There's a whole range of projects which the communities want and they need, and they are funded and they're going to be cracked on with. It is true that we have trimmed back the Kāinga Ora because Kāinga Ora was a financial basket case under the previous government. Debt was forecast to rise to $25 billion. They were running multi-billion-dollar deficits, and those are deficits that the taxpayer has to fund. The build costs were wildly out of control, far above market rates. Well, you can shake your head all you like, but these are the facts. And so we have put them on a path to financial sustainability and they're making great progress. Many of the projects that you think were cancelled were never funded and were never going to be built in the first place. So simply having a plan to do something doesn't necessarily mean something will actually happen. You can have an intention to do something. It doesn't mean it will end up happening. The last government lived in fiscal fantasy land.
Well, only because your government made a decision to give billions of dollars to landlords for doing nothing, for not building houses.
That's an allegation. Again, without
it's just
facts.
true.
That's
Restoring
also
basic
not
principles
within
to the tax
bigger
system
conversation.
around income are.
It is very relevant to the conversation of how we fund infrastructure long term.
Look,
Well,
I will.
you're entitled to your views.
We'll pick up one part of that question, then I'll go to Tangi for another sup. But my recollection has been given. You talked about KO and the cost of I think it was square metre rate. I saw a whole swag of private sector ones, which are about sort of 3 and a bit thousand-ish. KO sitting up there at about 5 and a bit thousand-ish per square metre. It wasn't even close. Am I far wrong?
No, I don't have the numbers in front of me because this is not the vote housing and urban development estimates, but we seem to have strayed into it. So I'm happy to talk about it. It's around 10 to 12% above equivalent for the market. And so I can report to you that you'll see some numbers later on, not for now, but they'll release them themselves. But I can report they're making good progress on getting their build costs down and becoming a much more efficient landlord, which is fundamentally what their role is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. Just picking up on your comment around cancellation of projects, and If we look at the IREX project that Nicola was cancelled back in December of 2023,
Cabinet cancelled it, but yeah.
that is an example of cancellation costs that are still ongoing quite some time beyond that decision being taken. There is an appropriation here that basically is just over $250 million for the current year. What is that money set aside for?
It's not in my appropriation, so I'm not really able to speak to
well,
it. It's
actually-
nothing to do with this vote, to be honest.
Well, actually it is, because it's been specifically referred to this committee from the Finance and Expenditure Committee. We have been referred, I think, 7 specific appropriations, and that is one of them. This is the Kiwi Rail Project IREX wind down, $253 million provision for the coming year, just over $250 million.
Okay, well, Lani from Treasury is telling me she can speak to it.
So
Well,
as-
no, hang on a minute. You're the minister.
It's actually.
You are responsible
What's that?
to this committee.
It's actually, I'm being told it's a Minister Peters matter, because he's the Minister for Rail. But Lani, do you want some commentary?
Well, actually, I'd like to hear the response from you, because you're the minister responsible for this. The appropriate minister is the Minister of Finance or the Associate Minister. So what is that just over $250 million set aside for?
Well, I'm going to get the Deputy Chief Executive of the Treasury to answer that.
So you don't know?
I am not the Appropriation Minister in charge of that part of the vote.
But you are the minister who's responsible for being accountable to this committee, because this is...
Yes, and I have an official here who wants to answer your question.
I think it is quite
Honey.
reasonable to be able to
Well, actually...
support people to say, hey.
Well, we're talking about just over $250 million here.
We understand.
Yes,
We're trying to get
and
an
there's-
answer.
One of 7
Trying to get an answer.
parts that have been referred, and the minister doesn't even know.
No, he didn't say that. He's going to get one of
Well,
one
he
of
doesn't,
the
because he can't
people-
answer the question.
No, he's going to get one of the people who's with him to answer the
That's
question.
very
So-
disappointing.
Yes,
Lani.
social behaviour.
No, it's not actually, Minister. My behaviour is about scrutinising the executive. That is our responsibility. It is disappointing that you don't know the answer to just over $250 million worth of taxpayers' money that has been set aside in your budget. You're an Associate Minister of Finance.
Deputy Secretary.
I think that's unfortunate behaviour, if anything. But if you need to rely on your officials, then...
I don't think the answer was he didn't know. He thought that the answer was best given by a Treasury official. So, Lani.
Well, I think he doesn't know, otherwise he'd answer it.
Lani.
Oh, okay. Earlier this year, with the establishment of the Minister for Rail position, all things to do with Kiwi Rail and the ferries were delegated to the Minister for Rail, so Minister Peters. So in respect, and it is still within, as you say, vote finance, infrastructure matters, but Minister for Rail is responsible for the appropriations with respect to Kiwi Rail and ferries.
Well, we've already
Sorry.
had the Minister of Rail this morning in front of this.
Why didn't you ask him about it then?
Well, we did ask the Minister about this, but this is a particular appropriation that has been specifically referred to this committee. So you're responsible. So perhaps you can tell me, what is the just over $250 million set aside for?
Yeah, so I think the figure that you're talking about relates to the cancellation of the ferry contract with the supplier, the Korean supplier, that was part of the decision that was made to cancel that contract. Negotiations for Kiwi Rail are still continuing in respect of settling that termination of that contract. I think the amount that you're referring to is the amount that has been put aside to support them in completing those negotiations, if I'm correct.
I think you'll probably also find there's a lot of wind down costs.
Well, it is
Which also
tagged as wind
includes
down.
those wind down costs.
I mean,
in respect of that.
the 47 million that's been spent has already, I think, been obviously accountable, but that's annual review stuff. Is there confidence that 300 million or the 253 million for the current budget 25 year, that will be sufficient as a provision?
Well, it's a commercial negotiation but the money's been set aside and, I can't provide an update on the commercial process underway.
Right, so you know the answer to that, but not actually what the 253 million is for.
Carlos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question may be a little bit over scope, but I will hope, to get an
I
answer.
will bring you back to scope because
Sure.
you reminded me earlier.
It's just good to hear the national infrastructure investment. How about at the local level? Mount Washington have faced significant challenge with its stormwater infrastructure, particularly during the Auckland anniversary floods and the recent Easter flooding as well. What action can the government take to improve the delivery and maintenance of the local water infrastructure in areas like Mount Wasco?
You're answering this.
At the risk of
as
frustrating the
Minister.
committee, I suggest you get the Minister of Local Government, who's responsible for water service delivery plans as part of the Local Water Done Well plan, in charge of that. It's not within my bailiwick.
So the point of order,
Yes.
you're out of.
Yes,
you're out of-
I just need to give the,
Infrastructure is one of these portfolios which is, it's sort of like everything's in it, but also actually from a scrutiny. I mean, we've had a really free-ranging debate, and I'm happy to do that. But I'm not responsible for literally everything that the government does that has a CapEx component to it. Local water is done through local government, as we've just had a testy discussion about. The IREX project is the responsibility of the Minister for Rail. I'm responsible for the system, and I'm happy to engage in debates about the system and the plans and all the rest of it. And obviously with my transport hat, I'm responsible for transport, but the infrastructure minister is a kind of system level lever to drive change across the system. But there are elements of the system that I am not responsible for, and IREX is one of them. Local water is another one. School property, for example, I have an interest in, and assisting Erica with that. But Erica Stanford is responsible for that. Health, for example, health infrastructure, Minister Brown is responsible for. So
All of which we have discussed.
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
well,
Well, at like
a
a high level, if you asked me about a particular capital program in a particular year for a particular region about a hospital, I freely admit I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, well,
But Simeon would be able to talk to you
Okay,
about that.
let's
That's
go.
my
Dan.
point.
Thanks, thanks, Mr. Chair. Minister, back to your appropriation for infrastructure. Are you able to tell us about any new investments in infrastructure within your portfolio that is included in budget 2025? Or are you saying really that it's basically in all other appropriations?
Yeah, well, that's sort of the point I'm trying to make, right? Is across Vote Health, there's $1 billion in capital within Vote Health for Nelson and Wellington Regional, for example. If you want specific questions about those, you direct those to those ministers. Happy to talk about the system, and happy to talk about the investment management system, which I'm responsible for. And if you've got specific questions about specific parts of the various different investments going on, best to direct those to the ministers.
Okay, so follow on.
It's challenging because I put my other hat on. I talk about transport and stuff, for example.
Yeah,
We've already asked you about, so.
We've already done transport.
So in terms of system investments, what are you most excited about in terms of investments in budget 25 that you think will make a real transformational?
So one of the things we did upon coming into government was system was a bit messy, to be honest. And so we've kind of tried to right-size the way central government organises itself. So the Commission's now in charge of strategy, and we've focused them up on that. We've got Crown Infrastructure Delivery, which we haven't talked about, which is it's in the name. It's focused on delivery, and they are a delivery agency that is going to do Crown Infrastructure Delivery for what we call non-capital intensive agencies, so agencies that don't have a specific delivery arm of their own. So take Archives, for example. Archives New Zealand just decides to build a new building or whatever. Great respect to them. They don't have expertise internally in Archives about how to do a relatively major project. So Crown Infrastructure Delivery is there to do that. They've interestingly been doing some school property stuff for the Ministry of Education, additional role growth classrooms and some seismic work just in the last year or so. The Ministry of Education's contracted them to do that. It's been a successful program. So we've got a delivery agency, we've got a strategy arm, and then we've got a funding and financing company, which is National Infrastructure Funding and Financing Company Limited, which is the old Crown Infrastructure Partners, the successor organisation to the UFB rollout. So we've kind of got different agencies now focused on the right, on all the different parts of the system that you need. Now, there's a bunch of people out there who say just chuck it all together, have some giant super agency or super ministry, sort of like an MB for infrastructure. We decided not to do that. We had a look at it. We decided not to do that. System level change, organisational change is quite hard. You've got impacts on morale. You've got, all of the reorganisation. All of that comes at time and expense and money. You got to be really clear when you do those kind of organisational changes that you're going to get efficiencies and get bang for buck. And so ultimately we decided have these 4 agencies and get them focused on what they should be focused on in the system.
Thank you.
Minister, considering the conversation we've just had, do you think we have too many ministers and that we could actually start reducing some of the ministerial portfolios that government has so that Parliament can ask questions and somebody gets answers?
People often say that, but the issue is not so much portfolios, because you can really have as many portfolios as you like, and you can have as many ministers as you like. The issue is efficiency of government, and as I've just indicated, we could, I could spend the next 3 years merging Treasury with Infracom and CID and NIFCO and add some other stuff in there, and that'd be all good. I could do all that, I could probably do that. I'd spend 3 years doing it. A bunch of people would lose their jobs, have to reapply, we have to create a new logo, find a new name, create a new website. I could do all that. The question is whether or not where you end up at the end of that process, is that going to build you a high performing system? And you have to be really confident it will end up like that. Otherwise, you've just wasted time and money for 3 years, and you're no further on than when you started. Because, I've been around long enough to see this game played out before. Everyone wants to reorganise stuff. Sometimes, and this is kind of my view and what we've essentially decided to do, it's just actually better to make do with what you've got and crack on, get the right people in the right roles, get the agencies focused on exactly what you need them to be doing, and just crack on. Reorganisation is not a substitute for actual work.
No, of course not. But what about ministerial portfolios? We've just had a conversation.
Well, I'm not in charge of ministerial
within scope.
Oh, okay.
That is an appropriation for the Prime Minister, not for me.
Well, I think it's an appropriate question. If
I'll
you
just do what I'm
interpret
told.
that correctly, it seems to me that he thinks the minister has too many portfolios.
I'm very happy with my lot in life.
I have one sup on that, which is finally we get one on CID. Just in terms of how that's going in terms of the take up of that and by agencies. I know Ministry of Education you mentioned, which is obviously I think it had a lot of its delivery taken away from it. But yeah, how's that take up going? And also how is CID being essentially I suppose it's client agencies saying, yep, we're seeing value for money out of that, as opposed to not seeing value for money out of that.
Yeah, so look, thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, over the last year since we're here and spoke about the inception of CID, we've supported the Ministry of Education with their short-term role growth program in Auckland. That's been very successful. Like the Minister said, there's agencies that are mandated to use this, which aren't capital-intensive agencies. The Ministry of Education was an example of an agency which was keen to use our services for a capacity-related issue that they had. Following on from the success of that program, we're supporting them with the Wellington Girls College seismic upgrade. So again, a project which they could give across to us for us to deliver on their behalf. We've made great progress with Auckland District Court for the Ministry of Justice, again a capital intensive agency which has delivery capability, but they just had a capacity issue with that project. It's quite a complex one, so it's a seismic upgrade and end of life services upgrade of that building that has to stay operational during the life of the construction contract. And from that there's been some additional scope that the Ministry of Justice has asked us to pick up off the back of that project. MPI is an agency that doesn't have delivery capability in-house, and they would have to build their own project delivery capability for the biosecurity facility, the plant health and environment building that they're looking at doing in Auckland. So we've been supporting them with that project. That's going through an implementation business case at the moment and aiming to get cabinet approval for funding of that project in a couple of months. And then once that happens, then we're in principle of the contract, main contractor there, and we'll get underway with building that one. And the Minister has already alluded to the work that we've done to support the DIA with the National Library works and off the,
What did I say? Archives.
it was archives, so the archives building, but there's
right,
National Library.
in the
there's a-
National, yeah.
and the National Library. So there's a structure that kind of links the two together. And off the successful delivery of the work that we did with DIA, they've asked us to look at additional work with some fit out and readiness for and the National Library for when the archives building comes live. So there's just a couple of examples, I think, of projects that we've supported agencies with. So there's a mix of agencies that don't have the internal capability or capacity to do it. So agencies that are not mandated to do us, but use us, and others that we are mandated.
I might follow up with a question about that later on when after we finish with the Minister. So, right, Kieran.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and there may be other questions from ministers. We've only got the minister for 5 more minutes. So I just want to come back to the role of government in downtowns. So there's Stats New Zealand show that there's 15,000 fewer people employed in construction than there were 18 months ago. That's massive. And earlier today, there was confirmation of around 3,500 Kāinga Ora builds having been stopped as a result of your reset. Now, regardless of your justifications of that, we obviously disagree, but you've got a view. That level of housing that would have otherwise continued having stopped surely has played a part in that. And when you have that many people no longer in work and industry associations saying that they're worried about their members falling over, would you consider at least some level of stimulatory activity in the construction sector to try and keep these workers here when we see so many going to Australia?
Well, as I say, we stand by the decisions around Kāinga Ora. It's been important. Many of the 3,500, saw your press release earlier, many of those projects were not funded. So, even by the previous government, they weren't funded. They might have been on the books as in potentially, future projects that might have been looked at. There's some land that Kāinga Ora owns that they're going to divest from, that in some cases they've owned since the early 2000s, that they've just happened to own, that they've gone through a pretty robust and thorough assessment process and had a look at them and said, well, we don't actually need this anymore. And they're just operating in the way that frankly, any proper commercial company should operate in, which is to look at the value for money of the projects that they're going to be engaged in and said, no, this is the wrong place. We don't need this land anymore. This house is in the wrong place. It's not economic to upgrade. So we're going to divest out of that, for example. And we've asked them to cut their cloth and get back to basics. And so they're going through a process of doing that. And I think it's the right thing. And you left the room, but I was saying when you were out of the room that the very, very promising indications so far around cost reduction coming out of the agency, cost of construction, for example, back office costs, tenancy satisfaction is actually up, not down. Which is interesting. We're having massive savings in terms of maintenance, for example. So more maintenance being done for less cost, which is really good. So some of that's coming through and has started in the last 12 months or so. But you're right that the economy has been for the last couple of years in a tough space, and we could get into the politics around, the cost of living crisis by excessive government spending and all that. Let's not get into that. The GDP numbers out today, 0.8%, double what most people thought. We're turning a corner. Building consents, most commentators agree, have bottomed out. We're now starting to tick back up again, which is really good. And, there's a big bow wave of infrastructure, particularly in the transport space coming. Again, I think you're out of the room, but I was talking about Melling. It's going to market construction contract. It's been signed, but it starts September, October. Otaki to North Levin, back half of this year. Brougham Street down in Christchurch, Waikiri Gorge on the East Coast. There's health capex coming into the market as well. So there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline that's coming, and a lot in delivery right now as well.
Yeah.
So no.
I think I answered the question.
Well, I asked you specifically, would you consider some stimulatory activity to keep our workers here and stop losing them overseas?
Well, there's stimulatory activity in the market right now from government across a whole range of different areas.
Okay.
The biggest thing we can do is get the OCR down and get the economy growing again. That is what will stimulate building work.
Julianne.
I had a question about NIFCO, which was set up at the end of last year.
Yes.
And, as part of the overall government system approach to,
Yes.
funding and financing infrastructure. And just wondering with that organization, how the government is going to make sure they're not like duplicating roles or processes with Invest New Zealand, which is also meant to be a shop front for getting
Yeah.
foreign investment into public
Good question.
infrastructure.
Good question. The way I would explain it is Invest New Zealand is pan sector and pan government, and is the kind of shop front for New Zealand internationally, going off and hustling, as the PM would say, on the world stage to get investment into New Zealand in its broader sense. NIFCO is your dedicated infrastructure agency in terms of offshore investment, but it's got a broader role than that. So they are essentially the ones we have tasked with bringing commercial expertise to the Crown, being a good client for the Crown in terms of engaging with the market around PPPs, for example, or complex financial structures and transactions as we move forward down the pipeline. They also have a role around the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which is a pre-existing piece of legislation, for example, to do those transactions. We've just given them, they also have a role in the administration of infrastructure funds. So again, this is part of the kind of cleanup of the system a bit. Kāinga Ora was in charge of the thing called the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, which is a $1 billion fund from the previous government, which was doling out money to councils largely. I'll get into how exactly that was worked through, but anyway, it exists. We haven't cancelled any of those contracts, but it didn't seem right to me that Kāinga Ora, which was fundamentally a state house building company, was administering the infrastructure funds to councils. That seemed a bit strange, so we've taken that off and given it to NIFCO, for example, which I think was the right thing to do, and that transaction's happened. We've also given them the role of the EV charger rollout. Again, didn't make a lot of sense, we think, for ECA to be doing that. Ultimately, we want it to be a commercially done series of transactions with the market for EVs, so we've given that job to NIFCO as well.
So
It's going pretty well so far.
So if there are foreign
Last one.
investors
Last one.
you're trying to get
Yeah.
to invest in public infrastructure here, should they go to NIFCO or Invest NZ?
Should go to
Going to
NIFCO.
Invest NZ and then go to
You should
NIFCO?
go, well, probably, we can do whatever they like, we can go to NIFCO. That's what it was set up for. That's the shop front.
Okay, so what's the point of Invest NZ?
As I said in my start of my answer, it's a pan-sector, pan-government agency to get, because there's plenty of other things that people want to invest in New Zealand other than public infrastructure. Heaps of things. Space, aquaculture, renewable energy. We profiled some of them at the summit. There's heaps of things we want overseas investment into New Zealand, other than public infrastructure. So that's the role of Invest New Zealand.
And on that note, thank you very much for
Thank you.
been a very entertaining and informative hour.
Look forward to coming back. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Minister.
We good? We're done?
Well, they're saying,
There's
Oh,
most of them
you're
are staying. Yeah, we don't let them out quite as easily.
How long have you guys got?
I was having time to.
Well, I think John should stay.
About some stuff
Right.
after the
John,
national.
you should stay.
Yeah, that's next Wednesday, 8th. I'll be I'll be flying out. We'll be out.
Come back. Yeah. Or.
Sure.
I mean, it's easier.
Okay, right. Are there any comments you wanted to make in advance? Maybe anything that you wanted to say that from the last hour that you feel help our conversation start with, and then I'll go to Kieran.
From my point of view, we're very happy to take questions. We're familiar with yourselves, you're familiar with us.
Right. Okay, well, can I also say we're looking forward to seeing the draft strategy and draft plan, National Infrastructure Plan, and having you come and talk to us about it. I think we have that down for the end of July.
Yeah.
So which I think was the first occasion after that you're able to do that. So looking forward to that. First of all, Kieran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for making yourselves available. I don't really care who answers this, whoever's the most appropriate, but I'm particularly interested in understanding water infrastructure. I'm conscious it sits with local government, and I
Oh, that's my question.
Yeah, I thought that you were very rudely dismissed, actually, Carlos, I have to say.
Oh, you weren't here when he was interrupting previously in the day.
Well, that's the third time I've been accused. No,
You were.
No, sir. But look, I know this is a local government thing in terms of policy, but actually, in terms of understanding the need for infrastructure investment, it does fit with the work that you're doing. Now, we have a situation where it was over a 30-year projection using council's own numbers, it was $185 billion worth of work. Now, we currently have a government response to that using only 10 years worth of figures, using the long-term plan of councils. And the difference between the two is quite substantial. With the 30-year projections, a lot of it was heavy at the back end. So a lot of the work was coming from year 11 to year 30. And part of the work that you're doing in developing the plan, not asking about the plan, I know that's going to be released next week. But if we're going to have informed decisions by government and the public and the opposition are going to be in a position to be able to hold those decisions to account, surely we need some mechanisms that actually have agreement on the level of work that is required over the next 30 years. And how do we achieve that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a sort of first crack at this one. I think, and this is kind of replicating a little bit like what we've done for the draft National Infrastructure Plan, which I think is a pretty good way of thinking about what we would like to see at the sector level. And so it starts with trying to understand the needs, right? What is it that we need to invest forward, and what are the drivers of demand in the water sector? We know that in this particular sector, there is an enormous deferred maintenance liability that councils are having to deal with right now. That's not the only, it's not the only demand. The other ones that I would sort of point to are population growth generally, particularly in growing councils. And the other one, of course, is resilience, where we're asking a lot more of our water infrastructure today than we have in the past. The problem, I think that, and I don't sort of know the ins and outs of the WICS number, the 185 billion that you've alluded to, but all of this needs to be done with an understanding of what, in this case, ratepayers actually can afford in the context of the household balance sheet. And the number that you've referred to, I don't think started in that place. And to my mind, this is sort of problematic of how we're kind of presenting these problems, is sort of unconstrained and very difficult to plan around because, why would you plan for something that you know you can't fund? So I think it starts with understanding what the needs are, what the affordability then looks like, and then trying to create the right incentives for local government water providers to start planning adequately into the future. And that's kind of the approach that we've taken for infrastructure writ large. And obviously in water, we're moving to a different model now, where we're thinking about regulation for the model, and a number of councils now using user charges to fund some of these things. So the sector is obviously in a state of flux at the moment as well. Not a perfect answer, but I think like starting with those fundamentals of what do we need, what can we afford, gets us moving forward.
Can I dive into that a little bit more? That's really interesting. You're talking about why would we look at things that we know we can't fund or unfundable? Isn't the point to try and understand the extent of the infrastructure deficit that we have in this country and the amount of work that we need to do? Surely that shouldn't be constrained by assumptions around ability to fund. We can then make decisions around funding, fully informed of how much work we need to do. That shouldn't be a constrained project based on assumptions around ability to fund.
Well, different sectors do this differently, of course. When you think about sort of more commercial models, like electricity or airports, that's exactly the place that they sort of start as, do we have a funder for this service? Clearly, what I would say though, of course, is that at the same time, you need to develop options around these things. So I guess what I'm trying to do is focus the mind. If you start from the perspective of we can fund everything, you're going to end up in a world where it's very difficult to know where to start, right? And I think that the sort of commerciality can help focus the mind on where the biggest and best value is. So I don't know if Raveen, obviously works in this sector.
No, I mean, it's a good question. And I think there isn't a single answer because it's a complex issue of consumers, asset management, as we spoke about earlier, funding and financing, and the unknowns of the future, demographics, changing standards, climate change. The answer really lies in the fact that you have to be good at the business that you are in. So the question you've posed, the number, whether it's 185 million, a billion, or whether it's 50 billion or 300 billion, really depends on the entities that are in the business. And the question is, do they know the business that they have been? And the problem is, in my view, we don't know the business that we've been in. So a lot of the models have been around rates, which is like a tax. So we'll just tax the people and they'll pay. Rather than, am I looking after my assets? Is this affordable? Are we using the resources efficiently? And the more you look at those options, as Jeff has said, the more it pushes you into behavior changes. And then you say, well, I should have metering, for example. I should have a funding plan. I should have a debate around whether I should maintain or renew or build, whether I should build big right now or whether I should build in stages and be more around adaptation because the future is unknown. It's a complex area, which I believe when Wix were doing the work, they aggregated it more from a umbrella viewpoint rather than building it from the bottom. They did it from the top. Then the work has been done since, bottom up. The reality is right now, the numbers are becoming bigger and bigger. It's not because we're going to do more work. It's because the cost of doing what was supposed to be done 5 years ago is now almost twice what it would have cost 5 years ago.
But so I accept all that. Kind of moved on from water now. This is just an understanding of how you look at how you approach understanding the infrastructure deficit. I won't move so far away that you won't be asked.
Can I just want to stop on that?
We will come back to water, but carry on.
Yeah,
Finish off your line and then we'll come back to water.
I accept what you're saying, but I do struggle with this idea because decisions around funding are ultimately up for the government. Now, you can't expect a government to have an informed consideration and Parliament to have an informed discussion if we don't have an adequate or accurate understanding of the level of work that is required, essentially the size of the deficit. And if factored into that process is an assumption of affordability, my concern is that you're actually limiting that process, limiting the debate and limiting the considerations. Because it is possible that a government might consider, in light of information that demonstrates the extent of the infrastructure deficit, new revenue streams as part of an informed debate. But if that isn't part of that process, you'll never get to that. It'll just be a continual assumption that it's unaffordable and it won't be part of the process.
It is part of the process, and you will see that in the National Infrastructure Plan, the discussion around it.
I appreciate it. A lot is being put on you in this.
Let me sort of tug on that a little bit more. I think one of the things we've been grappling with is this issue of how we go about pricing infrastructure services. And what we've seen is that the sectors, and we've gone through an exercise actually with the sectors to understand what does good pricing actually look like. As a general rule, I would sort of say that the sectors that perform really well on these sort of best practice pricing principles, they're able to right-size their investment. They're able to use demand management strategies to reduce pressure on the network so that you don't have to invest so much and you can keep prices down. The sectors that don't use pricing as much, so you think about the way that we do Fed and Ruck and transportation, or in some places we use rates to fund water. There's no pricing signal on use. There's no, I was looking at the work that just came out of New York today, that the congestion charge over there has reduced congestion levels by 25%. So a sector that's not using congestion charging is going to think that it needs more infrastructure to keep up because there's no pricing signal. So some of these things, how you fund infrastructure is actually pivotal material to what you think the deficit actually looks like. I mean, another example would be like waste, right? Where a very low waste levy has resulted in the requirement for more waste infrastructure. So you go across all of the sectors and see this. Development contributions on the periphery of cities is another example. If we don't get the pricing right, we're going to think we need infrastructure that perhaps, there's a question mark on.
Thank you.
Carlos.
Yes, I completely understand when you say it's the funding issues, it's the financing issues, not being practical, the rates people can't afford it. I mean, you can talk all day in front of a bunch of MPs sitting in Wellington, but maybe you can teach me, how can I respond to my constituent in their face when they lost everything because of the flooding, because of the stormwater damages their property? Can you teach me how I respond to them?
I don't know that specific example.
That might not be within the.
Like, how can I tell them, say, because we don't have enough funding? Like, you need to understand, we are not going to do anything to improve the water structure or the water infrastructure, and you just need to suffer the loss every 2 years or years. How can I explain that to them?
Yeah.
Like you explain a very good thing to me, but I just can't accept the answer.
Carlos, I think we're into a land use issue, which we did touch on briefly earlier this morning. We were talking about building consents and land use, and I don't think that's within the team's issues here. So they're definitely an RMA type issue. Look, I did have one though, sticking with the water theme for the moment, and that is one of the things.
You don't want them to respond first, or maybe they have an answer for me.
It's not within their terms of reference. Quite clearly,
None of them have responsibility for stormwater or infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, so look, just one of the things is that going back to Kieran's original 185 billion, that was predicated on a whole bunch of assumptions and standards, etc. Now, one of those standards particularly around wastewater, essentially, as I understand it, meant everybody stopping discharging anything to water, pretty much. The costs of some of those for some communities are astronomical. And I'd just be interested in what you have assumed about the standards that are, when you think about the 30-year infrastructure plan, what you assume about the standards, because certainly in engaging with a lot of councils, they are still working to that previous standard. I'll take one town of, less than 20,000 people, about 20,000 people. We're taking water, perfectly functioning wastewater system out of the waterways and putting it somewhere onto the land will cost them like $500 to $700 million and climbing, which is utterly unaffordable for that community. So I'm interested in what you are assuming when you think about the National Infrastructure Plan, what you're assuming goes in there in terms of the standards that are required in that wastewater in particular space.
I don't have a perfect answer to this. The way that we've constructed it, I think there's going to be iterations of how we go about defining what needs are. And what will be presented next week is a first go at New Zealand bringing together all of the needs across all of the infrastructure sectors that we have. And I think some part of the answer to this is because we hear a lot about deficits in almost every sector that we look at. And there is a call for some form of consolidated revenue in many of these sectors. And I guess what we're doing with this is, a problem shared is a problem halved, right? We want decision makers to see the full set of demands, whether it's earthquake re-strengthening, whether it's congested roads, whether it's these minimum levels of standards being invoked on local government. and so on and so on, and see that that looks very difficult, or at least understand what we're trading off when we make decisions in one sector or the other. As a general sort of funding principle for these things, where we're kind of coming from is thinking about infrastructure in two areas. The first is sort of networked infrastructure, or infrastructure that has a chance at paying for itself, right? It has some sort of user that could pay for the service. Generally, so you're thinking about electricity markets or transport markets or water markets, right? What we're saying for these sectors is that generally you want the network, the users, to pay for the service. It doesn't mean that you can't have cross subsidies across it, right? If you break it down, you're always going to struggle to fund rural roads compared to urban roads because it's a user problem. But the network as a whole should fund itself. Then you have a second class of infrastructure, which we're terming social infrastructure, which doesn't have much of a chance at funding itself through the user at all, right? This might be because it's healthcare services, might be education, defence is another example, community facilities or libraries. And this stuff here has no chance. This stuff has to be funded through consolidated rates, consolidated funds. Now, the better we are at funding our networks through users, the more we have to spend on the social infrastructure. But if we're not very good at that, if we're funding transportation through consolidated revenues, or we're doing the same through water, then there's going to be a squeeze at the other end. And the plan is designed to show the extent and nature of that squeeze all at the same time. So government can have a portfolio view of this rather than just looking one sector at a time and hearing the same things. We have a funding problem.
So if I take that, because there's a lot of areas, and I know you've been very strong on saying we should be pricing, and you said that again today. When you come out with a plan, with a national infrastructure plan, do you say, well, we are assuming that you are going to charge, it'll look like this. If you don't charge for some of these things, it'll be much bigger. Is that one of the things you're telling us?
No, we're actually not. What we're saying is that we're looking at past levels of expenditure in infrastructure, and we've gone back over the last 100 years to see what New Zealand has managed to spend on infrastructure through different political gyrations and through different economic cycles. And we're using that to provide a band of likely expenditure in the future. And that band represents what New Zealand has achieved in the past. There will be governments that spend a little higher, and there will be governments that spend a bit lower, but you can start seeing the range. And then that helps put some guardrails up on some of these issues. The specifics of debate between those, and it's a relatively wide band, that all has to take place. Absolutely.
Okay, I've got two subs here, Tangi and then Cam, and then a primary from Dan. Primary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, thank you. Look, just following up on the National Infrastructure Plan, I was going to ask about a couple of infrastructure players in the sector, but actually you've broadened that. You've talked about iterations, like this will be the first basically of many that would come.
Yeah.
What is the sort of time frame, longitudinal time frame for those iterations? And following on from that, what could you see as some sort of off-the-shelf roadblocks that might come along the way?
That's a great question. There's probably like three operational parts to the plan that I see continuing. The first is the stuff that I've kind of alluded to here, which we're terming forward guidance. And that is the Commission's view of what is a needs-based funding path for different sectors, and thinking about that split between renewals and new services, right? This is the first time that we will have brought all of this together in one consolidated portfolio view. It is something that I would expect us to be iterating, probably on a sort of biannual basis, there or thereabouts. The second part is the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is the mirror up to the sector. This is what the sector's planning, or infrastructure projects that it has in planning. The Minister alluded to this. There's about 206 billion in there already. We think that has about 2/3 coverage, and clearly we'd like to get that up to closer to 100%. We update that every 3 months, and we'll continue to do that. And then the third part of this is the Infrastructure Priorities Program, which is a structured independent assurance process to test readiness of projects. And we will be releasing our first round of results next week, but we intend to do this and release this twice a year so that we can build up to a mature list of projects at different stages of readiness that we can all sort of see. Yeah.
Any particular roadblocks that you might foreshadow as part of that?
I think I think with forward guidance, let me start there. I think this is, I wouldn't call them roadblocks, but I think the folks will be sort of learning what this is and what it isn't. It's independent advice, for instance. It's not government policy. I think bringing in a broader range of sectors is somewhere we want to go. We want to do it at the regional level. You won't see that initially. We also would like to give some colour around, if we're sort of saying you need to spend X billion dollars in this sector, what that looks like at an asset level. So, we know that equals so many schools or so many hospitals. So you get a bit more colour and flavour. So that would be a direction of travel there. Roadblocks on that. Some agencies have really good plans and we can see it and we can test against those. Some do not. Right, and this comes back to asset management maturity, which is at quite a low level in some cases. So that's a potential roadblock there. I think with the pipeline, the challenges in that space are, we do pretty well with local government, as you've heard. We do pretty well with central government, but private sector is a little harder. It's going to be harder to get the last few in there. And then with the IPP, I think for us, it's a voluntary process and it is designed to really shine a light on positive projects. And the truth is, we need your buy-in to make this work as a process. If it doesn't have buy-in as a process from decision makers, then it's not going to work. So that would be that one. Yeah.
It's almost up.
Okay. So over here then.
Thanks, Jeff and team.
Okay. Primary.
Hey, look, we're clearly really excited about next week and your plan. I'm just wondering, and it probably goes back to the discussion we had with the minister around the bipartisanship, and I'm keen on your impartial observations around the role that this plan next week may play in helping to get that bipartisanship. And you mentioned at the end, we need your buy-in. Could you give us some guidance around what specifically you think is going to be needed to be buy-in? I guess, is it number of projects, way to finance? I'd be keen for any observations you have on that.
It's a good question. I think the first is to have a very we would like buy-in into the assessment of affordability, like what affordable sort of looks like. Now, we don't expect anybody to pin this down with like great detail, knowing that, we're looking over a long time period and also, there's going to be discrepancies in what this looks like, but within bands, trying to project some funding certainty in the future, I think would be excellent, not just for the plan, but honestly for the sector and the ability to plan around those kinds of things. So I think that would be sort of point one. Point two is accepting where there are capital requirements, like the full gambit of things that we're actually like looking at here, and seeing that portfolio view, I think is really important. And then there will be a little bit more of I think the area where we are trying to more explicitly get some consensus around really is this asset management and renewals spot. There's a few reasons for this. The first is that, as I've said before, this is an area in a world of uncertainty, this is an area of highly certain expenditure. we will have to take care of existing assets that we already have that we highly, highly value. We know that sporadic maintenance is a lot more expensive than continuous maintenance. And so we think the case for this, notwithstanding a few edge examples of things like assets that you might be running down because you don't think you're going to need them in the future, we're not advocating maintaining payphones. So there are some edge cases to all of this, but the vast majority of the infrastructure we already have around us is going to need to be maintained. So starting there buys you about 60%. In some places, that number actually is much higher. If you don't have strong demand drivers, because let's say your population is not growing, or let's say that you face increased resilience challenges because of climate change, then the depreciation rate will be higher and the renewals will be more frequent. So that number looks higher. So there's just some basic maths that's pushing us in the direction of making the case that, hey, this is quite an important area. The second reason is simply that the emphasis on asset management and the current practice, it isn't there at the moment, and I think it's an opportunity to improve.
Great, thank you.
Kieran.
Thank you. Affordability is one thing, capability is another. And so I'm particularly keen from anyone really around the work that's underway, and you're thinking about how we ensure that we have the workforce here and the skill sets required, ideally through training programs and being able to attract many of our workers that have left the country to come back.
Yeah, well, look, it's a difficult question to kind of answer where, we need to get the right projects underway and in the market to keep the you mentioned engineers and architects that are leaving the country to Australia. We need those projects here to keep them interested. And look, the pipeline that Jeff and his team are looking at will help define what those projects are looking forward. But as it currently stands, it's it is pretty lean.
You think we could get to the point where we start talking about the funded pipeline? Because
yes,
yes,
we already are.
Yeah.
So, Ravine uses the word of what's the credible pipeline, which is what we all actually want to get to. So currently, you can search the pipeline for what projects are funded, and to give you a flavour of that, roughly half of it is funded. Right, so you'd look at it and go, well, roughly half of it.
Half of what specifically? Sorry,
the total number of 206 billion in the pipeline. Okay. So we ask for like, how certain is your funding when we solicit the information, and you can search by that. So you can get a sense of what that kind of looks like. Two other points that I would say here. The first is that we convert all of that pipeline information into workforce requirements. So, we categorize the projects that come in, and then we give a flavour of what that will mean in terms of engineers, architects, bricklayers, so on and so forth. And you can go and have a look at that. And so the uncertainty of the pipeline does translate into real uncertainty on workforce, which you hear from sector participants. So that's another tool that we have to sort of show this concretely.
That's good.
The second thing I would sort of say, and it's a little bit tangential because it's more about how we deliver projects, but the Commission is very vested in improving project leadership for capital delivery. And so we are invested in pulling together the network of people that is charged with actually delivering this stuff and improving the capability there. I think it was it was Ben Flyberg's work that said the single biggest factor in good delivery is good people. And we have a program of pulling all of those people together and actually thinking about succession planning, who's coming out, to improve the pipeline of capability to deliver all of this stuff. So that is front of mind and very critical.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Ken.
Thank you. I had a question. I mean, last year we heard from Crown Infrastructure. Was it no polling? What do you call it?
Crown Infrastructure Delivery.
Delivery. Heard about the Para Kiore Sports Centre and how you're taking on delivery of something that had gone well off track, but I was looking for how much more are we putting in as a Crown into getting that across the line, and how is the project tracking?
Project tracking very well. So since we spoke last year, we were able to reset the contract with the main contractor. So we were able to clear those kind of claims roadblocks that were causing the issues with being able to finish it. So we've got a clear pathway now to complete it. That's construction complete in October this year. So we're in the final stretch now of finishing the facility. Look, it's still a live contract. It has been reported. The project's at 500 million. If you recall, the contractor had put a claim against us or the government, well north of that. They were up around 750 million. Where we've landed is far less than where they were at. But because it's a live contract, I don't want to get into the details of where we are at.
Okay, so that and granted, you explained it to the committee last year about how we got into this situation with this particular project. Crown Infrastructure Delivery has multiple other projects on the go. What other steps have been taken since you talked to us last year to make sure that we don't have anything else get away on us?
Look, we've got good contractual relationships with the contractors. Our contracts are tight. Risk allocation is sitting in the right place of the organisation that's best placed to manage that. I think if we just again reflect on Parakiori and where things went badly there, look, it was very hard to forecast a global pandemic, and that had significant implications on the time and cost. That was a big one, and so you can't kind of manage that.
Did any of your other projects that you have in your portfolio right now, were they started prior to the pandemic?
No,
none of them.
They're all post-pandemic.
Okay, and
so I just would say the ones in our portfolio, and you'll see it in our reporting, are all tracking to time and to cost. So we're doing
fantastic.
They're going well.
And final question on this Parakiori is what is your role once that October handover happens? What role do you have after that, or does it all go to City Council?
So our role as a kind of delivery risk, for a better word, sits with us until practical completion, and at practical completion, the asset and the land is handed to Project City Council to operate. In October, they still have to do their own kind of familiarisation of the facility before they open it to the public, but the handover is at practical completion.
And practical completion, that's when there's a public.
No, so that's slightly different. Practical completion is that contractually the building is complete and can be ready for public use. The council will then issue a co-compliance certificate, which then allows public to use it. If the co-compliance certificate isn't ready to be issued, we can apply for a certificate of public use, which means.
And will there be any remaining costs for Crown Infrastructure Delivery? After October, will you be liable for anything? Will there be any risk on the books of CID for anything involving this project?
So any claims that arise pre-practical completion, that is something that we have to deal with and negotiate. So yes, there will be some risk that may be associated with that. But again, looking at, and I mentioned before, we cleared the barriers to a completion with the contractor there, so we're not foreseeing any major hurdles.
Okay, thank you.
Just two questions from me. One on CID, which is just so the intention is that you move to full cost recovery. So presumably you're not there at the moment.
We are full cost recovery on new projects that we're taking on board.
So you are there at the moment. Yeah.
No, so we've got we're in a transition.
Okay, so I'm talking about new projects.
So new projects,
how close are you to that point?
There's still a bit to go there, and we need, in order to get to a full cost recovery model, we need a large pipeline of projects that come our way.
Yeah. Okay, because it's overheads. Yeah. No, the reason I asked the question is because sounds like your clients who are saying we like what you're doing, and you've got some clients who are coming back saying give us some more, which you've already mentioned. Obviously, if you're doing that at something which is a discount to your full cost recovery, it might be also you're also pricing below what possibly they might have to spend if they were doing it. That's why I'm asking that question. So just interested in your answer.
So look, just some of the projects that we have got on our books, and I use Auckland District Court as an example where.
Sorry, which one?
The Auckland District Court
Yeah.
sideway upgrade. So that's one that we got appropriation from the government to see us through a certain number of projects. Auckland District Court is one of them. So Ministry of Justice aren't paying for our services on that project. We already had appropriation. Where there's
Anything
a variation.
Popular.
Where there's a variation to a contract and it's new scope, then the agencies will be paying for our services.
Okay, but the aspiration is to get yourself to a point where you are charging full cost recovery so that the agencies who are using your services can say, right, that's what it costs.
Yep.
We like it. Good. We're going with you.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Cool. And look, the other one is just, you said 60%, roughly speaking, Jeff, of total infrastructure cost is sort of is renewals and sort of replacements, etc. Which means the other 40% really is essentially levels of service and growth, correct?
Yeah, it would be split between a few things. Population growth, demographic change, income related things. As people get wealthier, they tend to demand higher levels of service, which is really what you're getting at. And then resilience, adaptation and decarbonisation are both.
Okay, which is a level of service in effect.
Yeah, you can think of it.
So I'm quite interested in trying to understand. If you can't tell me now, it's fine. But at some point in time, it's that cost of growth and what that looks like versus cost of level of service, what that looks like versus quite clearly we've got what the maintenance.
So what you will see next week is a bit of a flavour for how that looks like across different sectors. You'll be able to see the kind of stack of demand, and that growth will be demographic change is one of those. Yeah.
I think we're all looking very much forward to seeing this all out. we look forward to the launch.
Indeed.
Yeah. Is there any other questions? I think then that remains for me just to say thank you very much. We really appreciate that. We look forward to the National Infrastructure Plan launch, and then to having you back here in July.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.